All right. So, yeah, this one's gonna be a treat, guys. This one's gonna be wild. um, so the title of this YouTube video is using Freud to explain God. Now, I want to preface this with like a kind of warning, or not a warning, but just a kind of like, for your information, that everything that I'm going to say in this video should not be used to assert God's existence, or I don't want this to be somehow be interpreted as sort of mishandling of Freud or something like that. This is just what I'm going to call. This is simply a intellectual exercise of attempting to use Freud's concepts in a as wide as possible, right? As general as possible, extending out from the individual, right? So I'm even going further than, like, it's going to get very metaphysical, right? Clearly, because I'm calling it, using Freud to explain God, right? Okay, so let's get into it. So I've been reading, just to kind of give you guys the thought process here, is that I've been reading The Interpretation of Dreams by Sigmund Freud, right? And I've recently come across the chapter where Freud is trying to handle the issue with his theory of dream fulfillment, a wish fulfillment, essentially. So basically, if you don't know, Freud's theory of dreams starts with the idea that every dream is, in a sense, a wish fulfillment, right? Now, the problem that Freud comes across, and he begins to notice this, is that there's clearly dreams that people have, and clearly dreams that Freud has, that don't seem to portray and verify his theory of that a dream is, in some sense, a wish fulfillment. So in the attempt that Freud is trying to overcome this seemingly contradictory notion against his theory, he actually comes up with the idea that sometimes dreams can become distorted, right? In some sense, you could say the unconscious distorts the wish fulfillment, right? And so to kind of really break this down, it would go like this, right? So there's what Freud calls the latent thought, right? So it's the kind of unconcealed thought, or we could say the unconcealed wish fulfillment, right? But this, unfortunately, can be maybe too much, or too much truth for the consciousness to handle, right? So what will happen is it will become distorted in the opposite fashion, right? It will become distorted in the opposite fashion. So to kind of give an example, Freud talks about the hypocritical Otipus dreams, right? Or I'm maybe pronouncing that horrible, but yeah. And basically, a dream can manifest in a way that, like, for example, Freud gives a great example of his own dream where he in the dream he's having this increasing affection for a friend. But he realizes that this is actually a distortion to hide his more cruel feelings for the friend, right? Because he actually thinks that his friend is a simpleton, right? In this dream. But that is a more repressed content that Freud doesn't want to face up to, that he actually thinks that his friend is a simpleton, right? So this is why it gets distorted. It's sort of a harder truth to swallow, right? So in essence, the latent content, right, the more concealed wish will become distorted, and then it will become a manifest content, right? And the manifest content is the content that you would remember within the dream. Okay. And so I think that kind of, so that breaks it down, right? So everything that you would remember in a dream consciously is the manifest content. That's a better way to explain it. Okay. Now, to kind of like further break down what was previously said in the interpretation of dreams, is that basically in dreams, there's an idea, or you could use Freud's language, a wish, and the way dreams would work is that the idea becomes dramatized in the dream, right? It sort of plays itself out in a dramatization. And this is going to be very important to know with what I'm about to say. And so, in essence, the contents of your dream is you and not you. And you'll see why I say this. but strictly, so yeah. Okay. So again, how are we going to use Freud to explain God? So this is actually something that I kind of just toyed with like a kid, just kind of playing with concepts, and I figured that this would be kind of an interesting exercise to just play through and kind of just how can I answer like the real hard theological questions, just because I want to try to answer them, not because, and by the way, I don't actually subscribe myself currently to any specific religion. So this isn't, so this isn't anything like that. But for me, it's I like to intellectually think this through, and sometimes, to answer the hard questions. To be honest, I find the theological questions harder to answer than probably the opposite, the ones against the theological. So this is why I feel like I'm doing this. Okay, so all right, so the theory kind of comes like this. I use the more Abrahamic myth of creation, where we are made in God's image, right? And so I started playing with this concept of man being made in God's image. And what I thought was interesting was, okay, if typically God being made in man being made in God's image is for the most part perceived as a more physical representation, right? Like Jesus Christ and mankind and so on, right? This is the more Christian concept. But what I wanted to kind of extend in that notion was actually the psychic likeness, right? The psychic likeness to God, actually, in this manner. So what I actually constructed was, if Freud supposes that the human being has a sort of conscious and unconscious. Now, I decided to actually extend this to God, right? Where God himself would have a conscious and unconscious, right? And so now it gets really interesting. Now it gets really interesting because this is going to be wild. And, you know, I think Freudians are going to kill me for doing this, and, you know, they're going to nitpick all this. I know. And I apologize in advance. You know, even if I stretch this concept more than I should have. Again, it's just me attempting to kind of intellectually exercise the concepts that I'm learning from Freud, from the book, right? Really, that's the most that I'm doing, but at the same time, this is actually really entertaining and quite interesting when I played this out. So, okay, so back to the theory. All right, so what I actually supposed was this, that what we call reality, what we actually experience as human beings, is actually what I would call God's manifest content, right? God's dream, essentially, right? In some sense, you could say it's God's repressed manifest content. Now, what is God repressing? This is where jaws are going to drop, probably. Maybe not. I don't know. So I started thinking, what would God kind of, what is the wish fulfillment here? What is the wish fulfillment? And I was thinking, you know, in a lot of the mythological narratives of God is kind of this God that desires to be known, really. I mean, implicitly, it's basically that, right? A God that desires to be known, hence revelations and so on, and all this other stuff, right? But see, the thing is, that's actually what I'm actually proposing is that is actually the manifest wish that we experience, right? And actually the unconscious wish, the latent content of God, is actually his desire to stay unknown, right? So again, I'm going to repeat this so we kind of you know, to clarify where we are right now. So what I'm saying is that reality is essentially God's manifest content, his conscious wish, desire to be known, which would kind of imply the whole, you know, to feel mortal, to experience an other, to, you know, experience ignorance, all this other stuff, to kind of entertain all this idea, experience lack of goodness, lack of all this other stuff, right? To experience all this is the kind of desire to, this, in my opinion, plays all in the fact of the conscious desire to be known, right? Conscious desire to be known and experience another, right? So essentially, this is a kind of a lonely yearning God for love, right? But this is the conscious one, right? And so on. Now the unconscious wish of this God would be the wish to stay unknown, right? So because the desire to stay unknown perhaps is too strong of a truth, right, to swallow, right? What I'm actually saying is that God actually experiences, God actually goes through a distortion in his dreams, right? Where actually the manifest content will be struggle, suffering, evil, you know, basically just the struggle between opposites, right? The struggle between opposites. And because again, this is the the supposedly manifest desire to be known. But actually what is kind of going on is that there's actually this tension between God's consciousness and God's unconscious. And so what we actually experience in this manifest reality of God in his dream is we actually experience opposites, multiplicity. And again, these are all distortions of what is actually God's real wish, is that his desire to be unknown, right? And his actual affection, his radical love for himself, right? Which is perhaps a harder truth to swallow in some sense. It actually, his affection gets distorted into his desire to be known, right? His contentment is actually his distortion. His contentment gets distorted into the wish to be the desire to be known, right? Which would actually show a discontentment, a sort of yearning God to be known and to be loved and so on. But actually the unconscious wish is actually God's contentment to stay unknown, and basically his radical unity is his love already existing for himself, and no need to experience another. Okay. So yeah, that's basically the whole play of the using Freud to explain God in this way, right? That essentially there's this dialectical tension between God's consciousness and God's unconscious, which would actually explain why truth becomes concealed and unconcealed. There is leaks of repressed content that would kind of go into the dream and so on. So and in a really funny way, I'm basically saying that God is kind of experiencing a neurosis of a sorts. And I'm pretty sure that wouldn't make people happy and on the theological side, but actually it answers a lot of theological problems. You know, like, why does evil exist? Well, actually evil would just be a distortion. And suffering and all this stuff would be a distortion of the manifest dream, right? The sort of the dream that everybody remembers and experiences. And so on, right? It's the sort of disguise to hide the more unconcealed wish of God, right? Which would be the desire to stay unknown rather than to be known. And, and then of course also the questions of multiplicity, right? So this desire to be known, again, supposes that God wants to kind of experience the other, and so multiplicity then exists. But again, this is also a distortion because it's actually God's contentment with being a radical unity. Right? This is the disguise of that. And so on. So this is just wild. But hopefully that, I think that breaks everything down. Now, of course, I haven't been able to really think through on the more individual level. So in a sense that human beings would be essentially God and not God because they are the content of God's dreams. Now, the only... actually, there's something I wanted to say. So, in Freud comes up with the idea of the death drive, right? Human beings have a sort of unconscious drive towards death, right? Actually, right, and so in some sense, does this apply to God? And I actually thought about this. unconscious drive towards death in human beings would actually be God's unconscious drive towards himself, right? It's his desire to stay unknown, actually, which you could say is why human beings experience this unconscious drive towards death, which is God's own drive, own unconscious drive to stay hidden, right? To remain in this sort of unknownness. You could say nothingness, actually. Maybe that would help. But it's that unconscious drive towards remaining unknown and to yeah. What else would need to be explained? Yeah, I think that basically covers it for the most part. There's little intricate details that I haven't worked out that would be pretty fun to work out. This, so again, I haven't really worked it out too much on the more individual human level, but for the most part, on a very broad general level, like how would using Freudian concepts to kind of explain God was pretty fun for me, was pretty interesting, especially just learning the concepts. Let me know what you guys think, if it was an entertaining theory or a ridiculous theory, whatever the case may be. Go ahead, please share your concerns and comments. I thought it was rather fun, and it's really hard to tell people that I'm not on drugs because somehow they wouldn't believe me that I am not on drugs. I am definitely not on drugs to come up with this theory. So, yeah. All right. I will leave it there. Take care.